December 13th, 2018, just over a month ago, a majority of the United States Senate agreed with that proposition and voted to end U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. My colleagues, Mike Lee, Republican of Utah, Chris Murphy, a Democrat of Connecticut, and I brought together Republicans and Democrats in a very historic moment. For the first time, 45 years after the passage of the War Powers Act, the United States Senate came together to reassert its constitutional responsibility and make clear that the power of war-making rests with the United States Congress, not with a president, whether that president is a Republican or a Democrat, and that our unauthorized engagement in the war in Yemen must end.
The American people deserve more and should demand better than this. Now, we were very heartened when a few weeks ago the United States Senate voted for the first time in the 45-year history of the War Powers Act to call for us to get out. We sent a loud message to the executive branch. We've got two options. This is a binary choice. Let's either get out of this war in Yemen, or alternatively, have the president propose an authorization for the use of military force or declaration of war. Either way, this needs to come to one of those decision points. It's only when it's debated and discussed here that the American people can be brought into the process and we can have the moral authority to do what needs to be done there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Representative O'Connell.
Thank you, Senator Sanders. As Senator Sanders mentioned, this will be the first time in the history of this country since 1973 that we will successfully pass a war powers resolution through the Senate and through the House. I want to make one thing clear. This would not have happened if it were not for Senator Sanders' leadership. I'm going to recognize some of the others too. But when we in the House started this effort, they said, go talk to Matt Duss in Senator Sanders' office. Go talk to Senator Sanders. I said, he just got 13 million votes. He's not going to take this up. And we had a 5-minute meeting, and Senator Sanders said, I'm going to go and introduce this in the Senate. And that really gave this issue huge credibility, along with Senator Chris Murphy, who has been speaking out about the violence in Yemen for many, many years. So I want to recognize both of them. I also want to recognize Walter Jones, who was one of the first Republicans to co-sponsor this with Mark Pocan and me. Representative Jones is fighting for his life. Our thoughts and prayers are with him. But even in that position, he is committed to this resolution because he understands how important it is to end this war. And it's great to see Congressman Buck and Senator Lee here and Congresswoman Jayapal, who has pushed so hard to make sure we get a vote. I want to just make 3 basic points. Now, Amartya Sen said that famine is always a political problem. It's not because we don't have enough food or enough medicine. He did this study on the 1943 famine in West Bengal. 3 million people were dead, and it was because of human incompetence. 14 million people face the possibility of famine in Yemen. And it's not some complex reason why they face famine. They face famine because there's been a bombing of the ports, and the coalition isn't allowing the food and medicine to get in. They're blocking it with inspections. And what we're saying is let the food and medicine get in so we don't see pictures of kids starving. There's no complex foreign policy. It's a matter of human decency. And this resolution will make it clear that the coalition should stop the bombing campaign and come to the table and negotiate. The second point, people say, well, what difference is it going to make? What difference is it going to make on the ground? We know when Senator Sanders and Senator Lee passed the resolution in the House, this is reported fact. Secretary Mattis at the time called the coalition and said, stop embarrassing us. The Senate has just moved, come to the table and negotiate. I am 100% convinced that the only reason those parties have come to the negotiating table with Special Envoy Griffith is because the Congress is acting. You know, when I was young, we used to visit extended family in India. And one of the things my uncle said is when the United States sneezes, the world listens. Sometimes we underestimate how much influence we have. When we pass this resolution through the House and the Senate, I guarantee you that the coalition and the Houthis will come to the table to have a longer ceasefire. The final point, as Senator Sanders said, this is a clear reassertion of our role of Congress, so that in the future, when there is a president who thinks about getting involved in another intervention, they will know that the Congress isn't impotent. They will know that this Congress, on a bipartisan basis, is willing to invoke the war powers to prevent us from getting into more foreign interventions that aren't in our interest. Thank you.
Senator Murphy.
And so I am so thankful for Senator Sanders and Senator Lee's leadership, such that just a month ago we were able to convince the majority of our colleagues, finally, after years and years of pressing this case, that this is no longer in the security interests of the United States, nor is it allowable by the Constitution for our country to be involved in this war inside Yemen. From a moral standpoint and from a national security standpoint, the war inside Yemen is a disaster for the United States. And so we hear over and over again that the number one priority of our national security policy should be protecting the United States from attack again from radical extremist groups who may seek to do harm to us. Well, if that is your number one priority, then the United States needs to get the hell out of Yemen, where we are increasing the likelihood, not decreasing the likelihood, that we will once again be attacked by the most lethal harm of al-Qaeda, which is stronger than it was 3 years ago inside Yemen. The administration concedes to the humanitarian catastrophe. The administration concedes to the fact that the extremist groups inside Yemen have gotten stronger. The reason they present to us that we should continue our support for this bombing campaign is that the Saudis are an ally. What kind of ally kidnaps a resident of your country who is seeking our protection, brings him into a consulate, chops him up, and makes him disappear? The nature of this alliance has been exposed over the course of the last 30 days. The Saudis lied to us for 2 weeks about what happened to Jamal Khashoggi, just as they were lying to us for years about their true intentions in Yemen.
Thank you so much, Senator Sanders, and thank you for your tremendous, bold leadership on this issue, and I'd like to thank our other senators as well. I think this is an incredibly important moment for us as a bipartisan House and Senate to make our views clear. I want to especially call out my colleague, Ro Khanna, who in just 2 years has really become an expert on so many important foreign policy issues and has pushed doggedly to make sure that we do get this vote in the House, which will happen. Today's display is, I think, a powerful reminder of what a committed group of bipartisan lawmakers can achieve. For 2 years, members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which I have the honor of co-chairing with Representative Mark Pocan, have worked very closely with constitutional conservatives in both chambers of Congress to remedy a disorder that is also bipartisan in nature: unconstitutional war-making. We all have a shared understanding. Not only does unfettered, unauthorized conflict harm countless people abroad, it corrodes our democracy at home, and I think that is a very important point. In February of 1962, a reporter raised a criticism to President John F. Kennedy that he had, quote, been less than candid with the American people as to how deeply we are involved in Vietnam, end quote. Kennedy replied, "We have increased our assistance to the government, its logistics, but we have not sent combat troops in the generally understood sense of the word." These are his words. He said, "We are attempting to prevent a communist takeover of Vietnam." In reality, the U.S. government had already deployed military personnel to Vietnam, which ballooned to more than 11,000 so-called military advisors by the end of that same year. Both Democratic and Republican administrations concealed the true scope of U.S. involvement in the war, concerned that the American people would not support the active role that these forces had already begun to play in combat. Over a decade later, the War Powers Act of 1973 was enacted over Nixon's veto in reaction to a war that had engulfed Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, all countries that I've spent quite a considerable time in, killing millions of civilians. The legislative intent of that bill was made clear at the time: to prevent secret, unauthorized military support activities and to prevent a repetition of many of the most regrettable and controversial actions in Indochina. And yet for decades, U.S. military intervention has been deliberated on, decided, and executed in the corridors of the White House and the Pentagon in secret, behind closed doors, and without the consent of the governed. The American people have the constitutional right to a transparent debate and a vote by their members of Congress before a war is attempted and to end an unauthorized war already underway. But the legislature must act. And that is why, in the face of the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe, now nearly 4 years old, we are reasserting the War Powers Act to end the U.S.-Saudi military campaign. The Saudi regime has used blockades and bombings with U.S. participation to push 14 million people to the brink of starvation. Just as in Vietnam, U.S. forces secretly and illegally accompany, coordinate, advise, and provide logistical support to Saudi forces fighting in Yemen. So make no mistake, the United States is at war. Congress is poised to pass this bill in both chambers, marking the first time in U.S. history that the legislature will direct the president to end unconstitutional war. We have a moral obligation to enact this bill to end the violence, to allow food and medicine back into Yemen, and to ensure that millions of the most vulnerable people on earth not perish, but live. Thank you.
Questions? Yes, sir. Can you identify where you're from, who you are?
NBC News. Frank Thorpe, NBC News.
Frank.
The president tweeted this morning that, quote, the intelligence people seem to be extremely passive and naive when it comes to the dangers of Iran. They are wrong. Stepping away from the idea of Iran, but I mean, it's related in some ways. Why do you think the president is so skeptical of the intelligence agencies that work for him? And do you wish that they would listen to him, or he would listen to them more?
You're asking us to comment on a president's tweet.
On intelligence, though, I mean, this is
All right, look, we have a president, I don't want to go into my views on President Trump, who says one thing today and may say something very opposite tomorrow. Obviously, I think that a president of the United States might want to be listening to people who have made their entire lives the understanding of intelligence gathering and what's going on in the world. And that we have a president that disregards that is one of many, many problems that we have in the White House.
Cortez, Democrat from New York. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez is a first-term congresswoman. She's among the highest-profile members of this freshman class. I should mention with her tonight is her guest, Ana Maria Archila. She's an activist who confronted former Senator Jeff Flake last year in an elevator. She asked him to vote against Brett Kavanaugh for the U.S. Supreme Court, at the time in emotional terms, telling Senator Flake about her own experience with sexual assaults. I want to welcome you both here tonight. Thank you so much for making time to be with us.
Of course, thank you.
Congresswoman, let me ask you first, just for your response to what you heard tonight from the president. Obviously, this is the first State of the Union you've ever attended as a member of Congress. What was your experience tonight, and what did you think of what you heard?
No, I think that the president was unprepared. I don't think that he did his homework. We've seen States of the Union addresses delivered by many presidents, Democrat and Republican. They almost always have substantive policies that are offered. I agree with Senator Klobuchar there that there was no plan. There was no plan to address our opioid crisis. There was no plan to address the cost of health care. There was no plan to increase wages. It was, I had to ask myself, is this a campaign stop or is this a State of the Union?
Ana Maria, I was asking about your decision to be there tonight and the Congresswoman's decision to ask you. I wonder if you could both talk to us about this decision, how you came to it together.
Well, I was very honored when my congresswoman asked me to join her, and I understood it as an invitation that was just not just for me, but really it was an invitation for people across the country to tell their stories, to join in protest, to make democracy come alive, to breathe life into it by making sure that their demands, their aspirations are at the center of our debates. And I understood that was the message that you wanted to send, that you cannot do this alone, that you have this bold vision, but that you actually need everyone outside making a forceful demand of our members of Congress.
Absolutely. And I think that Ana Maria represents something so special about American democracy, which is that any normal person in any one moment has the courage inside them to step up in a critical moment that could change the course of our country. And I think that that's what Ana Maria did in that moment in the elevator. And it did change the proceedings of the vote. Senator Flake, as a result of her testimony and the way that she expressed her story, asked for a further FBI investigation before the vote proceeded.
Ana Maria, it's Brian Williams in New York. I have to ask you, because I was wondering this in real time, what it was like to be in the same chamber tonight as now Justice Kavanaugh, because we all came to know you in that videotape moment, as emotional as it was in the argument in real time.
It was sad. I am sad that the Supreme Court is tainted by a process that puts someone accused of sexual assault in the highest court of the land. I think he represents, in many ways, the inability of many politicians to actually understand that their role is to govern by listening and to actually allow themselves to be moved by the experiences of people that are different from them, who are trying to, with their stories, educate them. And in many ways, I feel sad for the many decisions that Kavanaugh is going to make that are going to impact many, many people, millions of people, my children probably, and women, LGBTQ families, workers, all of us, and that those decisions are always going to be tainted by a process that I continue to believe was irresponsible, and the people deserve better.
Congresswoman, thank you. Congratulations, by the way. We've never met, but congratulations on your upset victory in the primary. What did you make of the president's, I thought, pretty aggressive statement about Venezuela tonight? And he talked about being a socialist country and how we're never going to be a socialist country. It was pretty truculent, but it tied the notion of socialism to that particular regime. What do you think about the president, why he did that?
Well, I think that he needs to do it because he feels himself losing on the issues. Every single policy proposal that we have adopted and presented to the American public has been overwhelmingly popular, even some with a majority of Republican voters supporting what we're talking about. When we talked about a 70% marginal tax rate on incomes over $10 million, 60% of Americans approve it. 70% of Americans believe in improved and expanded Medicare for all. A very large amount of Americans believe that we need to do something about climate change and that it is an existential threat to ourselves and to our children. And so I think he sees himself losing on the issues. He sees himself losing on the wall, on the wall on the southern border, and he needs to grasp at an ad hominem attack. And this is his way of doing it. But what we really need to realize that what is happening is that this is an issue of authoritarian regime versus democracy. And in order for him to try to, dissuade or throw people off the scent of the trail, he has to really make and confuse the public. And I think that that's exactly what he's trying to do.
Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and Ana Maria Archila, thank you.
David Stockman, our friend in Liberty. David, welcome to our program.
Happy to be with you. And my point here, Dan, is that the real swamp in Washington is on the Pentagon side of the Potomac River. That's where the real swamp is, the military, industrial, surveillance, congressional pork barrel complex, if you want to put it all together. And he has just fed the monster. If you look around Washington, the great prosperity, the building, and all these new hotels and restaurants and office buildings, et cetera, apartment buildings, all of that wealth is coming from the fact that we spend $800 billion a year on the whole intelligence complex and defense contracting, the Pentagon, and the hundreds of thousands of people who work for it, all in the name of empire.
We're not spending enough money on it.
And until we decide that we aren't an empire, that we're a republic again, that we can't afford to be an empire,
We're not spending enough money on it.
that we failed as an empire, that non-intervention has to be the touchstone of policy. Until we do that, you're never going to bring the military-industrial surveillance, $800 billion swamp under control. So that's my perspective on it.
We're not spending enough money on it.
And at some point, we're going to have a fiscal crisis soon.
We're not spending enough money on it.
Because for the reasons we've just discussed. And then maybe in the context of a real fiscal crisis where interest rates are going up and everybody's panicking and they don't want to cut all their favorite pork barrel projects at home, maybe we'll get a second look at this massive swamp, as I say, on the Pentagon side of the river. If we do, I think maybe there's some hope. If we roll back the warfare state, maybe you have a chance of at least curtailing the welfare state. If you do both of those, then you've got a chance somewhere down the road of having relative national solvency. But we're nowhere near close now. We're going in the wrong direction at a very rapid, accelerating speed. I'm talking, here fiscally, because despite, given all this spending, the huge increase in the defense budget, a tax cut that may or may not have been a good idea, but it needed to be financed.
Right.
And they just got out the credit card and wrote a 1.7 trillion additional debt. I'm saying with all of that happening, and then going into the 2020s, when the entire baby boom generation of 80 million strong is going to be retiring and putting huge pressure on Social Security, Medicare,
Right.
all the rest.
David, I want to ask you something a little philosophically about our foreign policy. This weekend, Tulsi Gabbard announced that she's running for president. She's a progressive type Democrat from Hawaii, and she's announced that she's running. But she has a foreign policy that I think that you and I could be very, very supportive of, because it sounds a lot about what we talk about. She's a non-interventionist, and she's not bashful about it. But on her announcement, boy, did she get hit. She got hit by the media. She got hit by Republicans and Democrats. And evidently the cards are stacked against us, as if we didn't know. But just make a comment about that, on how vicious the attacks were. And it sort of shows you that this is not a partisan issue. The deep state is nonpartisan.
We're not spending enough money on it.
And they're in control, and boy, did they go after her. And that's why I think we struggle. And thank goodness people like you are on our board, and we try to change that attitude about foreign policy, because obviously that contributes, like you point out, tremendously to our deficit.
We're not spending enough money on it.
Yes, it is really staggering what happened this last weekend, particularly when NBC just ran a smear job based on some experts, so-called, who really are just, contractors for the federal government. They live off the deep state.
We're not spending enough money on it.
And they were the same folks who were involved in trying to plant the false flag Russian interference in the Alabama Senate race a few months back earlier last year. So when I saw the viciousness and intensity of this attack, it was just a reminder once again that the mainstream media, and I call CNN the war channel, and that's what it is, and MSNBC is actually worse, and then you can throw in the New York Times and the Wall Street, or even the Wall Street Journal on foreign policy, and the Washington Post. That's your mainstream media. They're entirely handmaids of the warfare state. It's based on what we could call access journalism. They want to get leaks from the Pentagon or the State Department or the National Security Council, or even the various 17 agencies of the intelligence complex. You have to basically butter them up and spin the stories and news in a manner that they approve. This is what's happened to the mainstream media.
We're not spending enough money on it.
So It's really too bad, but I look forward to her candidacy and having those 24 Democrats on the podium there in their version of the primary debates, and hearing at least one very articulate, fluent advocate of non-intervention. She's been great on everything. I really admire her foreign policy position. And also, she served 2 terms in Iraq. So she, you can't say she's some kind of pinko, pacifist who doesn't understand the world. I don't know where she gets her views from and her good advice, but she is very impressive.
Right,
I hope she can raise enough money to stay in the primary and at least have a fair debate and expose some of the handmaids of the warfare state who are running in the Democratic primary or will be.
Yeah, that'll give us some enjoyment. It'll remind us of something that happened about 10 years ago, too. But, as long as we're sort of on current events, to do a quickie, because I guess we're getting somewhat close to time closing. But dominating the headlines, dominating our thoughts, dominating what we're doing right now, is this whole business with Venezuela. Everything is on the table. We've got to reinstall democracy in Venezuela. What's your take on this, David?
Well, it's just another case of the neocon interventionist world policeman notion of foreign policy rising to the surface, and Trump falling for the debate, as he has several times. And then, if you can imagine this, one of the worst neocon war mongers that has plied his trade in Washington for the last, 4 decades, talking about Elliot Abrams, who goes all the way back to our intervention in Central America during the 1980s and the Iran-Contra affair and all the rest of it. And then he was a chief advocate and proponent of the Iraq war when he was in the second Bush administration. How in the world can a guy who ran on America First and that, we're going broke trying to run the world, appoint this guy to be his point man for Venezuela? It just tells you the swamp is so deep. And you can look at the cover of my book. I think you had it on before. I got the creatures crawling all over the White House. And
we're not spending enough money on it.
This is a case in point. And
we're not spending enough money on it.
It's something I posted a while ago on my site, David Stockton's Contra Corner. I said, Trump has pulled a Truman, whether he realizes it or not. He essentially nationalized Citgo, which is based down there in your end of the world, Ron, in Houston. It's an American petroleum company that happens to be owned by Venezuela. He nationalized it and basically said, all the revenue that you generate and the profits that would normally be upstreamed to the Venezuela government will now be sent to the alternative government that we've decreed to be the official government of Venezuela. Now, if that isn't a return to the kind of gunboat diplomacy that we practiced even before World War I don't know what is. This is really disappointing, and I think it's a reminder to all of us just how tenacious and how dug in and how all-pervasive.
We're not spending enough money on it.
The deep state ideology is in Washington.